In a quiet suburban neighborhood where every house looked almost identical, where freshly painted fences lined up perfectly and lawns were manicured to perfection, a single backyard stood out. Not because it was flashy or expensive, but because it was alive. Lush green plants and vibrant flowers flourished in a large backyard garden that had become the pride and joy of the homeowner. This garden was not just a patch of grass and some flowers. It was a dream nurtured over years, a testament to hard work, patience, and a deep love for nature. The garden had rows of vegetables, herbs, fruit trees, and colorful blooms that attracted butterflies and birds. It was a sanctuary, a place of peace and hope in an otherwise strict and rule-bound neighborhood. The homeowner, who had moved here with their family to build a happy life, found solace in tending to this garden every morning and evening. What started as a few pots on the porch grew into a small vegetable patch, then into a flourishing oasis of greenery that was admired by neighbors and strangers alike. Children from the neighborhood would often peek through the fence, fascinated by the unusual abundance of life in such a controlled community. But not everyone was pleased. The Homeowners Association, known around the neighborhood for its strict enforcement of uniformity and regulations, had long kept a watchful eye on the garden. It wasn't illegal to have a garden, but rules about appearance, property use, and landscaping standards were so rigid that anything out of the ordinary raised suspicion. The HOA's president, an infamous figure in the neighborhood, was a woman everyone whispered about but rarely confronted openly. Known as Karen among the residents, she took her role very seriously and was notorious for targeting anything that strayed from the HOA's perfect image. One day, the homeowner received a formal letter stamped with the HOA's seal. It was a warning about the garden, stating that it violated the community's landscaping rules. The letter claimed that the garden was unsightly and not in keeping with neighborhood aesthetics, and demanded immediate removal of several plants, including fruit trees and vegetable beds. The homeowner was shocked. This garden had brought life and joy, and now it was being threatened by bureaucratic rules enforced by a woman who saw nature as a threat to her control. The homeowner tried to reason with the HOA, explaining the benefits of the garden: fresh organic produce, a safer space for children to learn about plants, and an increase in property value thanks to the lush greenery. But the HOA's response was cold and uncompromising. Karen was determined to enforce the rules and issued a fine threatening further legal action if the garden wasn't removed. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood about the garden dispute. Many residents sympathized with the homeowner, but few were willing to stand up to the powerful HOA president. The community was divided. Some feared retaliation, while others quietly admired the homeowner's courage. The homeowner realized this wasn't just about a garden anymore. It was about standing up to an oppressive system that valued conformity over community. Refusing to be intimidated, the homeowner began researching ways to fight back. They discovered the concept of a community food forest, a shared space where neighbors could grow fruits, vegetables, and herbs together. A food forest wasn't just a garden, it was a symbol of unity, sustainability, and resistance. It was a way to reclaim the backyard, not as a private oasis, but as a source of nourishment and connection for everyone. The homeowner reached out to neighbors who showed interest. Slowly, a small group formed, united by the desire to protect their right to green spaces and fresh food. They started meeting quietly, planning how to expand the garden into something bigger, a community food forest that would be impossible for the HOA to ignore or ban without facing backlash. As preparations began, Karen's scrutiny intensified. The HOA sent more letters, calling meetings, and trying to intimidate the group into disbanding. But the homeowner and their neighbors only grew more determined. The garden that started as a personal passion was transforming into a community movement. This was the beginning of a battle not just for a garden, but for the soul of the neighborhood. A story about standing up to authority, protecting nature, and creating something beautiful in the face of adversity. The first seeds of change were planted. But would the homeowner and their allies succeed against the iron grip of the HOA Karen? The next chapter would reveal how the garden's fight became a fight for the whole neighborhood's future. As spring arrived, the backyard garden that once belonged solely to the homeowner began to transform into something much larger. What was once a personal sanctuary was quickly evolving into a symbol of hope and rebellion against the rigid rules of the Homeowners Association. The homeowner had succeeded in gathering a small group of like-minded neighbors who shared the vision of a community food forest, a place where everyone could grow their own fresh fruits, vegetables, and herbs right in the heart of their neighborhood. These neighbors, initially hesitant, started volunteering their time and resources. Some brought seedlings and tools, others donated compost and mulch. What had been an isolated garden was becoming a vibrant, interconnected green space that invited participation and connection. The Food Forest Project began to take shape. Layered planting designs mimicked natural forest ecosystems, maximizing yield and biodiversity while nurturing the soil. It was more than gardening, it was a movement towards sustainable living and community empowerment. However, with every new plant and every new supporter, HOA Karen's wrath grew stronger. The HOA board called emergency meetings, sending more stern warnings and threatening hefty fines. Karen used every tool at her disposal, from legal jargon to psychological pressure, attempting to intimidate the homeowner and their allies into compliance. She portrayed the food forest as an eyesore, a potential hazard, and a disruption to the community's order. Yet, the project gained momentum. Social media became a battleground. The homeowner created a dedicated page to document the garden's progress, sharing pictures of blossoming plants, harvests, and the growing number of neighbors involved. Stories of people reconnecting with nature, learning to grow their own food, and supporting each other resonated far beyond the neighborhood's borders. Comments flooded in from other communities inspired by their courage to stand up to restrictive HOAs. The narrative was shifting. This wasn't just about a garden, it was about reclaiming the right to green spaces and community connection. Meanwhile, within the neighborhood, a subtle shift was occurring. Neighbors who had once been silent or even fearful were beginning to voice support. Some discreetly placed small pots of herbs on their porches. Others lent a helping hand during planting days. The fear of HOA Karen's reprisals was real, but so was the desire for change. A silent majority was quietly siding with the Food Forest Initiative, hoping for a more inclusive and vibrant community. Karen, sensing her grip weakening, doubled down. She attempted to enforce archaic landscaping rules, issued citations for unauthorized structures like garden beds, and demanded the removal of fruit trees, citing pest concerns. She even threatened to cut off access to community amenities for participants in the garden project. But each move only drew more attention and sympathy to the homeowner's cause. The homeowner and their neighbors began reaching out to local environmental groups and city officials. They found allies who supported sustainable urban gardening and were willing to advocate on their behalf. The story gained traction in local news outlets. Reporters interested in the David versus Goliath battle between residents and an overbearing HOA. This public exposure made it harder for Karen and the HOA board to suppress the movement without backlash. Yet tensions escalated. One night, several of the garden's newly planted fruit trees were found vandalized, branches snapped and leaves scattered. It was a cruel message, a warning from an unknown antagonist hoping to crush the community's spirit. The homeowner was devastated but refused to back down. Instead, they organized a neighborhood cleanup and replanting event, turning the vandalism into an opportunity to bring people closer. The food forest was no longer just about plants. It was about resilience, unity, and the fight for a better way of living. As summer approached, the garden blossomed with renewed vigor, and the sense of community grew stronger. But HOA Karen was not finished yet. Her next move would escalate the conflict to a new level, forcing the homeowner and their allies to prepare for the biggest showdown of the entire battle. The seeds of resistance had sprouted, but would they survive the storm ahead? The community's future hung in the balance as the food forest blossomed, and the fight for it intensified. Summer had arrived in full force, and with it, the backyard food forest flourished. What was once a small garden had now become a sprawling ecosystem of fruit trees, raised beds overflowing with vegetables, and herbs filling the air with their fragrant scent. The community gatherings grew in size and spirit. Neighbors who had once been wary were now regular visitors, sharing stories, seeds, and the harvest from the garden. It was more than a garden. It was a lifeline, a green refuge in a world that often felt disconnected and artificial. But as the garden thrived, HOA Karen's fury reached a boiling point. She could no longer tolerate this open rebellion against her authority. The HOA board, Under her leadership, issued a formal cease and desist letter, accompanied by a threat to take legal action if the garden was not dismantled immediately. They claimed the food forest violated several covenants, citing unauthorized land use, property value risk, and community safety concerns. The tone was harsh, calculated to intimidate not just the homeowner, but every participant in the movement. The homeowner, knowing the stakes had just been raised, rallied their allies. The legal fight was about to begin. They sought advice from attorneys specializing in property law and community rights. To their surprise, the HOA's claims were questionable and could be challenged. This wasn't just a fight about a garden anymore. It was a fight about personal freedoms, community empowerment, and the right to reclaim their own land. HOA. Karen tried to sway neighbors by spreading rumors about the garden causing pests and attracting unwanted wildlife. But the community saw through these tactics. A group of volunteers began documenting the positive impact of the food forest, how it encouraged pollinators, improved soil health, and even reduced neighborhood waste through composting efforts. The media attention intensified, with local news crews filming interviews and coverage that highlighted the homeowners'